Number 1. Charles Cullen, the angel of death who killed across 9 hospitals for 16 years. There are certain truths about the medical profession that most people accept without question, and one of the most fundamental among them is that the person standing at your bedside in a hospital uniform, adjusting your foreline and checking your vitals, is there to help you heal. That belief, that unspoken contract between caregiver and patient, is the invisible foundation upon which the entire healthcare system rests. It is a trust so deep, so instinctive, so woven into the fabric of human vulnerability, that most people never think to question it. And it was precisely that unquestioning trust, that absolute dependence, that Charles Edmund Cullen exploited for 16 consecutive years across 9 hospitals in 2 American states, leaving behind a trail of confirmed deaths that numbered at least 29, while investigators and prosecutors who studied his career closely believed the true number could stretch into the hundreds. Charles Cullen was born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, the youngest of 8 children in a family that was defined almost from the start by loss, instability, and emotional devastation. His father died when Charles was just 9 months old, leaving his mother to raise 8 children largely on her own in circumstances that were financially strained and emotionally overwhelming. The household Charles grew up in was not a warm or nurturing one, and by his own later accounts, he spent much of his childhood feeling invisible, overlooked, and profoundly disconnected from the world around him. As he moved through adolescence, those feelings of isolation deepened rather than resolved, and by the time he reached his teenage years, he had already begun to demonstrate the kind of psychological fragility that would follow him for the rest of his life. He attempted to take his own life multiple times as a young man, and those attempts were not isolated cries for help, but rather the earliest visible symptoms of a psychological suffering that he would never fully address, never fully resolve, and ultimately never escape. After finishing high school, Cullen enlisted in the United States Navy, and for a time it appeared that the structure and discipline of military life might give him the anchor he had never found in childhood. He served aboard the USS Woodrow Wilson, a submarine armed with Poseidon missiles, and rose to the rank of Petty Officer 3rd Class. Even in the Navy, however, his fascination with medicine and with the proximity to care and healing was evident. He was drawn to assisting the ship's doctor during medical procedures, and on at least one occasion, he was found wearing surgical clothing and latex gloves that he had taken without authorization from the ship's medical cabinet, a detail that in retrospect carries a chilling resonance given everything that would come later. He was medically discharged from the Navy in 1984, and within months he had enrolled at the Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing in Montclair, New Jersey, a decision that would ultimately put him in a position of enormous and terrifying power over some of the most vulnerable people imaginable. He was a capable student, personable enough when he chose to be, and he was elected president of his nursing class, a fact that speaks to the degree to which he was able to present a functioning, socially acceptable exterior to the world around him even as something far darker was developing beneath the surface. He graduated in 1986, married a woman named Adrienne Taub in 1987, and by 1988 he had secured his first nursing position in the burn unit of St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. The year 1988 was also the year that Charles Cullen committed what investigators would later identify as his first confirmed murder. The victim was John W. Yengo Sr., a 72-year-old retired Jersey City municipal judge who had run for mayor of his hometown twice and was, by all accounts, a respected and accomplished man. Judge Yengo had been admitted to St. Barnabas with what appeared to be a severe allergic reaction, and under ordinary circumstances he likely would have recovered and returned to his life. But Charles Cullen had access to his foreline, and on June 11, 1988, Cullen injected a fatal dose of lidocaine into the judge's intravenous line, causing his heart to stop. The death was recorded as resulting from Stevens-Johnson syndrome, a rare and sometimes fatal skin reaction, and no one questioned it. No investigation was opened. No alarm was raised. A man had died under suspicious circumstances in a hospital ward, and the nurse responsible simply went back to work. What followed over the next 15 years was a pattern so consistent, so methodical, and so protected by the institutional failures of the American healthcare system that it stands today, as one of the most disturbing examples of systemic negligence in the history of modern medicine. Cullen moved from hospital to hospital with a regularity that in retrospect appears almost rhythmic. When suspicions began to accumulate at one facility, when a rash of unexplained deaths drew enough internal attention that his presence became uncomfortable, he would leave, voluntarily or otherwise, and present himself at the next institution with references and credentials that gave no indication of the concerns that had gathered around him at the previous employer. He was investigated at St. Barnabas after contaminated 4 bags were discovered in 1992, and he left. He moved to Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, where he administered fatal overdoses of digoxin, a heart medication, to at least 3 elderly women, including 90-year-old Lucy Letby, who died on March 9, 1993, and 85-year-old Mary Natoli, who died in July of the same year. From Warren Hospital, he moved to Hunterdon Medical Center in Flemington, New Jersey, then to Morristown Memorial Hospital, then to Warren Hospital again briefly, then to the Rawling Memorial and Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Pennsylvania, then to Easton Hospital, then to St. Luke's Hospital in Fountain Hill, Pennsylvania, and finally to Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey, where the killing continued at a pace that, in retrospect, reflected either extraordinary brazenness or an absolute certainty that he would never be caught. At Somerset Medical Center alone, in just 1 year of employment, Cullen killed at least 13 patients, including 21-year-old Michael Strinko, who had been admitted for a spleen surgery from which he was expected to make a full recovery. Michael Strinko was the youngest of all of Cullen's confirmed victims, and his death, the death of a young man who had every reason to believe he would leave the hospital healed and whole, perhaps captures more clearly than any other the full moral weight of what Charles Cullen did over those 16 years. Cullen was not killing only the terminally ill, not only those whose deaths were expected, not only those who might have died soon regardless. He was selecting victims seemingly at random, or at least without any consistent criterion of mercy or suffering, and administering drugs that sent their hearts into failure while they lay helpless in their beds. The medication he most frequently used was digoxin, a drug prescribed in controlled doses for heart conditions but lethal in overdose, and he would access it through the hospital's automated medication dispensing machines, known as Pyxis machines, ordering medications for patients who had not been prescribed them, sometimes in the early hours of the morning when the wards were quietest and oversight was at its thinnest. The investigation that ultimately led to Cullen's arrest began in earnest in the autumn of 2003, when pharmacists and administrators at Somerset Medical Center began noticing a troubling pattern. An unusually high number of patients who had died or nearly died had been found to have elevated levels of digoxin in their systems, and the records of medication orders showed that someone had been accessing the Pyxis machines and requesting medications for patients who had no clinical reason to receive them. The internal review pointed to Cullen and the hospital, in a moment that stands in stark contrast to the institutional cowardice that had allowed him to move freely through the healthcare system for so long, did something extraordinary. They reported their findings to law enforcement. Detectives Tim Braun and Dan Baldwin of the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office took over the case, and they quickly understood that they were dealing with something far larger than a single suspicious death at a single hospital. They needed evidence, and they needed it in a form that would hold up in court, and so they turned to someone who knew Charles Cullen personally, a nurse at Somerset named Amy Luffren who had developed a genuine friendship with him during their time working together. Amy Luffren was herself dealing with a serious heart condition that made her own future uncertain, and the revelation that her friend and colleague might be responsible for the deaths of the patients they cared for together was a blow of staggering proportions. But she agreed to help. She agreed to wear a recording device and meet with Cullen outside the hospital, and in a conversation at a bar in Bridgewater, New Jersey, with investigators listening from nearby, she confronted him about the suspicious deaths, gently and carefully drawing him into admissions that would prove critical to the prosecution's case. Cullen was arrested on December 15, 2003, and the full scope of what he had done began to emerge in the months that followed. He entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors in multiple counties in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania, agreeing to help investigators identify his victims in exchange for a guarantee that the death penalty would not be sought. The cooperation was slow, agonizing, and deeply incomplete. Cullen struggled to recall the names of many of those he had killed, and investigators had to piece together the evidence case by case, hospital by hospital, year by year. He ultimately pleaded guilty to 22 murders and 3 attempted murders in New Jersey, and to 7 additional murders and 3 attempted murders in Pennsylvania. He was sentenced in March 2006 to 18 consecutive life sentences, with his earliest possible parole date set at June 2403, a number so distant in time that it is essentially a formal statement that Charles Cullen will die in prison. At his sentencing hearing in New Jersey, the family members of his victims were given the opportunity to address him directly, and what they said in that courtroom was a profound and heartbreaking articulation of what it means to lose someone you love to a person who was supposed to protect them. Mary Strenko, whose 21-year-old son Michael had been Cullen's youngest confirmed victim, stood at the lectern and said to the man who had taken her child, "My heart aches for my son. I walk around with a hole in my heart." Other family members called Cullen a demon, a coward, a monster, and worse. And throughout the proceedings he sat motionless, his eyes closed, wearing a bulletproof vest beneath his sweater, refusing to look at the people whose lives he had permanently altered. Superior Court Judge Paul Armstrong, who presided over the New Jersey sentencing, told Cullen directly, "You betrayed the ancient foundations of the healing professions." That sentence, precise and measured as it was, may be the most accurate summary of what Charles Cullen did across 16 years and 9 institutions. He did not merely commit crimes. He betrayed a profession built entirely on trust. And in doing so, he caused a damage to the relationship between patients and caregivers that extended far beyond the families of his confirmed victims. Number 2. Lucy Letby, the neonatal nurse who preyed on the smallest and most helpless patients of all. There is a particular kind of trust that parents place in the nurses who care for their premature and critically ill newborns in a neonatal intensive care unit. And it is unlike almost any other form of trust that exists in the human experience. When a baby is born too soon, when the child who was supposed to arrive months later comes into the world fragile and fighting, the parents who stand outside the glass and watch the tubes and monitors and machines are entirely dependent on the people inside that unit to protect what is most precious to them. They cannot be there every moment. They must sleep, eat, step away from the ward. And during those hours they are away, they place their child's life in the hands of the nurses who have dedicated their careers to caring for the most vulnerable patients in any hospital. Lucy Letby was one of those nurses. She worked in the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital in northwest England, and she presented herself, and was perceived by most of those around her, as a dedicated, caring professional who had chosen one of the most demanding and emotionally intense specialties in nursing because she genuinely wanted to help. She was, by many accounts, the kind of nurse who stayed late, who went out of her way to provide comfort not just to the babies in her care, but to their anxious parents waiting outside, who seemed to embody the qualities of compassion and commitment that the profession demands. What the parents who trusted her, and the colleagues who worked beside her, and the managers who received glowing assessments of her performance could not have known was that Lucy Letby was, between June 2015 and June 2016, causing the deaths of babies in her care and harming others in ways that, when the full evidence was eventually laid before a jury at Manchester Crown Court, would take more than 10 months of testimony and 22 days of deliberation to fully absorb and assess. Lucy Letby was born on January 4, 1990, in Hereford, England, and grew up in what appears to have been a stable and comfortable household. She pursued nursing as a career with apparent conviction and trained specifically in neonatal care, completing her qualifications and joining the staff at the Countess of Chester Hospital, where she would eventually be assigned to the very unit in which her crimes took place. There was nothing in her background, no obvious trauma, no documented instability, no prior warning signs that suggested what she was capable of, and that absence of explanation became one of the most haunting aspects of the case as it unfolded in court and in the public consciousness. The events that prosecutors would later argue constituted a deliberate and sustained campaign against the smallest patients on the ward began in June 2015, when the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital experienced a sudden and dramatic increase in the number of baby deaths and unexpected collapses. Before that month, The unit saw approximately 2 or 3 baby deaths per year, a number consistent with the serious nature of the cases it handled. But in June 2015 alone, 3 babies died within the space of 2 weeks, and the collapses and deteriorations that followed over the next 13 months were so numerous, so severe, and so concentrated in time that the lead consultant at the unit, Dr. Stephen Breyer, began to look for a pattern. What he found, when he examined the staffing rotas against the timeline of incidents, was a correlation so stark that he brought it to hospital management in October 2015, just 4 months after the first deaths had occurred. Dr. Brier's concern was direct and specific. He believed that Lucy Letby's presence on the ward was linked to the deaths and collapses, that the correlation between her shifts and the incidents was too strong to be coincidental, and that she needed to be removed from patient care while an investigation was conducted. The response he received from hospital management was not the urgent protective action that the situation demanded. Instead, the hospital's most senior manager required the consultant doctors to write a formal letter of apology to Lucy Letby, instructing them to stop making allegations against a colleague. 2 senior consultants, Dr. Breyer among them, were ordered to attend mediation sessions with Letby as though the issue were a workplace dispute rather than a safeguarding crisis. When Letby was eventually moved off the neonatal ward, the decision was not framed as a protective measure for the babies, but rather as an administrative reassignment, and she was placed in the hospital's risk and patient safety office, where she had access to sensitive documents from the very unit being investigated and was physically located near the senior managers whose job it was to investigate her. An independent analysis conducted later would determine that Lucy Letby was approximately 80% more likely to be on duty either during or immediately before a baby collapsed, a statistical finding so striking that a senior nurse who conducted the analysis told the subsequent public inquiry that when she saw the numbers, she was so disturbed that she immediately urged hospital executives to call the police. That plea was ignored. It was not until 2017 that Cheshire Police formally began their investigation, and Letby was not arrested until July 2018, more than 2 years after the final incident on the ward. By the time she was arrested, she had been working in an administrative role at the hospital for nearly 2 years, and the police investigation that followed was one of the most complex and painstaking in British legal history. Detectives reviewed thousands of medical records, consulted dozens of experts in neonatal medicine and forensic pathology, and worked case by case through the incidents to build an evidence base that could withstand the scrutiny of a criminal trial. What they found, confirmed by expert after expert in the courtroom that would eventually hear the case, was a pattern of deliberate harm carried out through methods that exploited both Letby's medical knowledge and the inherent complexity of caring for critically ill newborns. In some cases, she had injected air into the bloodstreams of the babies, causing air embolisms that triggered sudden and catastrophic deterioration. In others, she had used nasogastric tubes, the thin tubes that pass through the nose and into the stomach to deliver nutrition to babies too small or too ill to feed normally, to force excessive quantities of air or milk into the infant's stomachs, causing internal damage. In 2 cases, she had administered insulin to babies who were not diabetic, causing their blood sugar to drop to dangerously low levels in a way that mimicked natural metabolic crises and was extremely difficult to detect. One of the most significant pieces of evidence in the investigation was a blood test result from 2015 that had been taken from one of the babies on the ward. The results showed dangerously elevated insulin levels in the child's bloodstream, a finding that should have triggered immediate investigation at the time it was recorded. It had not. The significance of the result had been overlooked in the chaos of managing a medical crisis, and it was only when Dr. Breyer discovered it years later, reviewing old records in the course of the investigation, that its true meaning became clear. The trial of Lucy Letby opened at Manchester Crown Court in October 2022, and it lasted 10 months. Believed to be the longest murder trial in British legal history. The prosecution presented meticulous evidence for each of the 13 victims named in the indictment, 7 babies who had died and 6 who had survived but been harmed, and the picture that emerged from that evidence was one of a nurse who had moved from baby to baby in the neonatal unit, in the quiet hours of the night and early morning when oversight was at its lowest, causing harm in ways that were designed to be invisible, to look like the natural deteriorations that are unavoidable. part of caring for extremely premature infants. The defense argued throughout the trial that the deaths and collapses were the result of natural causes, that the statistical correlation between Letby's shifts and the incidents was coincidental, and that the prosecution's medical experts had misinterpreted complex neonatal presentations. Letby herself testified that she had never harmed a child, maintaining her innocence throughout the proceedings with a composure that many observers found deeply unsettling. The jury was not persuaded. After 22 days of deliberation, they returned their verdict on August 18, 2023, finding Lucy Letby guilty of 7 counts of murder and 6 counts of attempted murder. The victims she was convicted of murdering included 2 sets of twins and the 2 babies from a set of triplets, and among those she had tried and failed to kill was a baby boy she had attempted to harm on 2 separate occasions. Justice James Goss sentenced Letby to a whole life order, the most severe sentence available under British law, which carries no possibility of release at any point. In the history of British criminal justice, only 3 other women had ever received this sentence before Letby, and their names, Myra Hindley and Rosemary West among them, give some indication of the category of offending into which the courts had placed her. Letby did not attend her own sentencing hearing, a decision that was legally permitted but which provoked enormous public anger, particularly from the families of her victims, who had prepared statements describing the impact of her crimes and who had to deliver those statements knowing that she was refusing to hear them. The parents of her victims, who spoke of their children in terms of devastating simplicity and love, children described as tortured, children described as deserving to come home, children described as having their lives stolen by someone whose job was to protect them, made clear in their statements that the harm Lucy Letby had caused extended far beyond the neonatal unit and far beyond the families directly affected. It had shaken the confidence of every parent who had ever placed a sick child in the care of a hospital, and it had exposed institutional failures so serious that the British government ordered an independent public inquiry. That inquiry, led by Lady Justice Thirlwall, examined how it had been possible for Letby to continue harming babies for 13 months after senior medical staff first raised concerns, and its findings, published in stages from 2024 onward, were a damning indictment of the management culture at the Countess of Chester Hospital, which had prioritized the protection of the institution and the comfort of an accused employee over the safety of the babies in its care. Senior Nursing Director Alison Kelly was suspended from her subsequent role following information that emerged during the trial. Other managers faced professional investigations. The lead consultant who had first raised the alarm, Dr. Stephen Breyer, called publicly for NHS managers to be subject to the same professional regulation as doctors and nurses, arguing that the events at Chester had demonstrated that without accountability, management decisions could cost lives. Lucy Letby's appeal against her convictions was refused by the Court of Appeal in 2024, and she remains in prison serving her whole life sentence, the 4th woman in British history to be told she will never be released. She was 33 years old at the time of sentencing. In July 2024, a retrial on one of the counts on which the original jury had been unable to reach a verdict resulted in a further guilty verdict for an attempted murder, adding to the weight of evidence that had already been laid against her. Number 3. Niels Hogel, the German nurse who turned patient resuscitation into a performance of power. The hospital ward at night has a particular quality to it that is difficult to describe to those who have not experienced it, a kind of compressed stillness in which the sounds of medical equipment and the soft movements of nursing staff carry an unusual weight. It is in those hours, when patients are most vulnerable and oversight is at its most attenuated, that the character of those responsible for patient care matters most. Niels Hogel understood the night ward very well. He had worked in intensive care units in 2 German hospitals, the Klinikum Oldenburg from 1999 to 2002 and the Klinikum Delmenhorst from 2003 to 2005, and he had developed during those years a particular reputation among his colleagues, one that was initially flattering but would take on an increasingly sinister dimension as time went on. His colleagues called him Resuscitation Rambo, a nickname that reflected the frequency with which he seemed to find himself at the center of medical emergencies, the nurse who was always there when a patient's heart stopped, always ready with the defibrillator, always present in the moments of crisis that defined intensive care work. He appeared to relish those moments. He appeared to seek them out. And the reason, as he would eventually confess to investigators and then again in open court, was that he was creating them himself, injecting patients with cardiovascular drugs that pushed their hearts into crisis so that he could then step in and attempt to bring them back, to demonstrate his competence and earn the admiration of his colleagues, to experience what he described as the thrill of having a life in his hands and the power to decide what happened to it. Niels Hogel was born in 1976 in the coastal town of Wilhelmshaven in northern Germany, and by his own account his childhood was stable and protected, free of the kinds of obvious trauma that investigators often look for when trying to understand how a person arrives at the decisions he made. His grandmother and his father were both nurses, and he cited them as his role models for entering the profession, a detail that in the context of everything that followed carries a particular irony. He trained as a nurse and took up his position at the Klinikum Oldenburg in 1999, working in intensive care where he had direct and frequent access to the medications that he would use to orchestrate the emergencies that defined his crimes. The death rate in the units where Hogel worked was anomalous from early in his career. Colleagues noticed, and some raised concerns internally, that patients seemed to deteriorate with unusual frequency when Hogel was on shift. At Oldenburg, the head physician became sufficiently concerned that by September 2002, he confronted Hogel directly, and the outcome of that confrontation was not a formal investigation or a police referral, but rather a quiet internal solution, the suggestion that Hogel either resign or accept a transfer to a less critical area of the hospital. Hogel accepted a transfer to the Klinikum Delmenhorst in December 2002, and he was given a clean professional reference that said nothing about the concerns that had accumulated around him at Oldenburg. It was a decision that would prove catastrophic in its consequences, because at Delmenhorst the pattern continued, the emergencies multiplied, the death rate on his ward rose sharply, and his colleagues' unease deepened into something closer to open suspicion. The moment that finally ended Niels Hogel's career came on June 22, 2005, when a colleague witnessed him manipulating a syringe pump to administer Agmelin, a cardiovascular medication, to a patient for whom it had not been prescribed. The patient suffered cardiac arrest and subsequently died. The colleague reported what she had seen, and Hogel was suspended from duty. In a detail that would later become a source of significant public anger, hospital management at Delmenhorst kept Hogel on site for 2 more days after the incident before taking formal action, and during those 2 days, he made one final injection into a patient who also died. He was arrested in the summer of 2005. His first trial, in 2008, resulted in a conviction for attempted murder related to the incident in which he had been caught in the act, and he was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. But as Hogel served that sentence, and as the scope of what he had done at both hospitals began to come into focus, it became clear that the 2008 conviction represented only a fraction of the harm he had caused. A second trial followed in 2014 and 2015, examining additional deaths at Delmenhorst, and in February 2015 Hogel was convicted of 2 murders and 2 attempted murders and sentenced to life in prison. He confessed during those proceedings to having caused approximately 90 cardiac crises at Delmenhorst alone. But investigators now suspected that the full picture was far larger, and what followed was one of the most extensive forensic investigations in German criminal history. Police and prosecutors reviewed more than 500 patient files and hundreds of additional hospital records from both facilities. They exhumed 134 bodies from 67 cemeteries across Germany, and in some cases from as far away as Poland and Turkey, tracing the remains of patients who had died during Hogel's shifts and whose bodies had been returned to their home countries for burial. Toxicology was performed on the exhumed remains, and the results were devastating. In case after case, the presence of cardiovascular medications that the patients had not been prescribed was confirmed in the tissue, evidence that was both scientifically compelling and morally overwhelming in its implications. Hogel's third and final trial began in Oldenburg in October 2018. He faced 100 counts of murder, covering the full scope of what investigators had been able to confirm at both hospitals. At the opening of the trial, he made a statement that was extraordinary in its directness, confirming that all the charges against him that he had admitted to were true, though he disputed or could not remember many of the specific cases. He described what he had done in terms that revealed the psychology behind it with unusual clarity. He had felt bored. He had wanted to impress his colleagues. He had derived a sense of power and satisfaction from being the person who intervened in a crisis, and when crises did not occur naturally often enough to satisfy that need, he manufactured them. He described the feeling of resuscitating a patient as a kind of euphoria, and he admitted that after the birth of his daughter in July 2004, he had returned to his first shift afterward and, in what he described as an attempt to sustain the feeling of happiness he was experiencing, had injected a severely ill patient with a toxic substance that same night. The jury at the Oldenburg District Court deliberated on the evidence for each of the 100 counts and returned their verdict on June 6, 2019. They found Niels Hogel guilty of 85 counts of murder and acquitted him on 15 for lack of sufficient evidence. Judge Sebastian Behrman, in delivering the sentence, told Hogel, "Your guilt is incomprehensible. The human mind struggles to take in the sheer scale of these crimes." He sentenced him to life in prison and included in the judgment a notation on the particular seriousness of the crimes, a finding in the German legal system that effectively removes the standard possibility of parole after 15 years and signals that the court considers the offender too dangerous to ever be released. The victims Hogel was convicted of murdering ranged in age from 34 to 96. They had been patients in intensive care, people who had come to hospital in states of serious illness, and had placed themselves entirely in the hands of those responsible for their care. Families who had spent years believing their loved ones had died of natural causes were now confronted with the truth that those deaths had been caused deliberately by a man who had stood at the bedside and administered the injections himself. The response among the families who gathered outside the court in Oldenburg on the day of the verdict was a mixture of devastated relief and profound, unresolved grief. Some were grateful that the truth had finally been established. Others, including Frank Brinkers, whose father had died during Hogel's time at one of the hospitals, but whose case could not be conclusively proven, were left in the painful position of suspecting the truth without ever receiving formal confirmation of it. The institutional failures that had allowed Hogel to continue working, to be transferred from one hospital to another with a clean reference, to be arrested in 2005, and yet have the full scope of his crimes go uninvestigated for years, resulted in 6 former employees of the Klinikum Delmenhorst being charged with negligent manslaughter for their failure to act on concerns that had been visible long before the incident that finally ended his career. The case also prompted significant reform of patient safety and monitoring practices in German hospitals, with new protocols introduced to track and investigate unusual mortality rates in any given ward or unit. Number 4. Beverly Allitt, the angel of death who targeted children on a ward in rural England. The English county of Lincolnshire, with its wide agricultural landscapes and its small market towns, is not a place that the imagination readily associates with the kind of crime that shook its communities to the core in the spring and early summer of 1991. Grantham, a town of modest size about 100 miles north of London, had a general hospital that served its local population with the kind of unpretentious dedication that characterized rural healthcare in Britain at the time, and the children's ward of that hospital, Ward 4 of Grantham and Kesteven Hospital, was precisely the kind of place where parents brought their children expecting safety, attentiveness, and care. For a period of 59 days between February and April of 1991, Ward 4 was instead the location of a series of attacks on children that left 4 dead and 9 others harmed in ways ranging from serious to permanent, all carried out by a single nurse who had been working on the ward for only a matter of weeks and who presented to everyone around her as engaged, helpful, and deeply committed to her young patients. Beverly Gale Allitt was born on October 4, 1968, in Grantham, and her early life, while not dramatically unusual, was marked by a pattern of behavior that in retrospect takes on a disturbing significance. From childhood onward, she exhibited a persistent need for attention that expressed itself in ways that were increasingly concerning as she grew older. She visited medical facilities frequently, presenting with ailments that doctors could not verify or that disappeared without clear explanation. She self-harmed. She sought the involvement of medical professionals in her life to a degree that went far beyond what her physical condition appeared to warrant, and the pattern became so pronounced that it would eventually be central to the expert testimony at her trial, where a leading specialist in unusual psychological presentations described her behavior as consistent with Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition in which a caregiver harms someone in their care in order to generate the attention and drama of a medical crisis. Alit trained as a nurse at Grantham College and applied for a position on Ward 4 at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in early 1991. She had not distinguished herself academically during her training, had a history of excessive sick leave, and had not completed her full qualification as a state-registered nurse, holding instead the lower-level status of state-enrolled nurse. None of this prevented her from being offered the position, and she began work on Ward 4 in February 1991. Her first victim was Liam Taylor, a baby boy who was 7 weeks old and had been admitted to the ward with a chest infection, a condition that, under ordinary circumstances, a child of his age and otherwise reasonable health might have been expected to recover from without serious complication. Alit went out of her way to make herself indispensable to Liam's care, volunteering for extra shifts and reassuring his parents about his progress in terms that made them feel their child was in capable hands. When Liam suffered a respiratory emergency and then went into cardiac arrest, and when his brain was left severely damaged by the lack of oxygen that followed, the medical team attributed the collapse to the underlying infection. His parents, acting on medical advice, made the devastating decision to remove him from life support, and Liam Taylor died on February 21, 1991. Alit was never questioned about her role in what had happened to him, and she returned to work the following afternoon as though nothing had occurred. 2 weeks later, Timothy Hardwick, an 11-year-old boy with cerebral palsy, was admitted to Ward 4 following an epileptic seizure. He was a child who had already navigated significant medical complexity in his short life, and the epileptic fit that brought him to hospital was serious but not, in itself, necessarily fatal. Alit took over his care, and shortly after she was left alone with him, he was found without a pulse. Despite the immediate response of the resuscitation team, Timothy Hardwick could not be revived, and his death was attributed to complications from his epilepsy. What followed over the next 2 months was a series of incidents so clustered, so concentrated, and so consistently associated with the presence of Beverly Alit that, when the investigation finally began, the pattern would appear to investigators as something that should have been impossible to miss. Child after child on Ward 4 deteriorated suddenly and severely, often shortly after Alit had been alone with them. Some recovered, some did not. The parents of the children involved moved between gratitude for Alit's apparent dedication and grief for what their children had endured, never imagining that the nurse who seemed so committed to helping could be the source of the harm. The investigation that brought Alit's crimes to light was initiated not because management acted on any formal concern, but because a police superintendent named Stuart Clifton was assigned to examine a suspicious death that had been reported through a separate channel. And in the course of that examination, he began to look at the broader pattern of incidents on Ward 4. What he found when he reviewed the records was a series of cases in which elevated levels of insulin had been detected in the blood of affected children, and a separate set of cases in which physical evidence pointed to the introduction of air into the bloodstream. He also found that the nursing logs from the ward for the relevant period were missing, and that when a search was conducted, those logs were discovered inside Beverly Alit's own home. The only common factor across all 25 separate suspicious episodes that Clifton and his team identified, episodes involving 13 separate victims, 4 of whom had died, was the presence of Beverly Alit. She was there at every single incident. No other member of staff could be placed at all of them. Alit was charged in November 1991, and her trial began at Nottingham Crown Court in February 1993. During the proceedings, she was present for only 16 of the trial days, repeatedly absenting herself due to illness, a pattern entirely consistent with the psychological profile that the prosecution's expert witnesses were presenting to the jury. Professor Roy Meadow, a leading specialist in child protection and unusual medical presentations, explained to the jury in detail the nature of Munchausen syndrome by proxy and its manifestation in Alit's behavior, and the evidence he presented, combined with the physical evidence from the victims and the statistical impossibility of her presence at every incident being coincidental, was sufficient to overcome her plea of not guilty. On May 23, 1993, Beverly Elliott was convicted of 4 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, and 6 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. Justice David Latham sentenced her to 13 life sentences, the harshest sentence ever imposed on a woman in Britain at that time, and told her directly that she represented a serious and continuing danger to others and was unlikely ever to be considered safe enough to be released into the community. She was sent not to a conventional prison but to Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottinghamshire, a high-security psychiatric facility, where she remains today. The minimum term attached to her sentence is 30 years. In 2023, she appeared before a mental health assessment panel as part of a process to determine whether she might be transferred to a mainstream prison, a development that prompted the fathers of 2 of her victims, Steve Gibson and David Crampton, to issue public pleas that she never be released, articulating with quiet devastation what it has meant for their families to live for more than 30 years with the knowledge of what she did. Beverly Elliott is 57 years old. The 4 children she murdered were a baby of 7 weeks, an 11-year-old with cerebral palsy, and 2 other young children, each of whom arrived on ward for needing help and found instead the person who had volunteered to look after them. Number 5. Orville Lynn Majors, the Indiana nurse who transformed a rural hospital into a ward of fear. There are small towns across the American Midwest where the local community hospital occupies a place of particular significance, a place where generations of families have been born, where the elderly come to be cared for in their final years, and where the staff are known to their patients not just as professionals, but as neighbors and members of the same community. Vermilion County Hospital in Clinton, Indiana, a town of fewer than 5,000 people situated about 60 miles west of Indianapolis near the Indiana-Illinois state line, was exactly that kind of institution. It was a small rural hospital with a 4-bed intensive care unit, staffed by people who had chosen to work there precisely because they wanted to serve the community they lived in, and for most of its history, it was a place that fulfilled that role without drama or notoriety. That changed when Orville Lynn Majors joined the nursing staff. Orville Lynn Majors was born on April 24, 1961, in Linton, Indiana, a small coal mining community not far from Clinton. By the account of those who knew him in his earlier years, he was a person who seemed to have arrived at nursing through genuine motivation. As a teenager, he had taken care of his elderly grandmother during a period of serious illness, and that experience of providing hands-on care to someone he loved had, he said, led him toward healthcare as a vocation. He graduated from the Nashville Memorial School of Practical Nursing in 1989 and, after a brief period working in Tennessee, returned to Indiana and took up a position as a licensed practical nurse at Vermilion County Hospital in 1993. He was, by the accounts of his supervisors and many of his colleagues, a capable and popular nurse. He received glowing performance evaluations. Elderly patients in particular appeared to like him. He was known outside the hospital as a man of diverse small business interests, running a pet shop and a flower shop in Linton, a figure who seemed to be a functioning and contributing member of a tight-knit community. The numbers at Vermilion County Hospital began to change shortly after Majors returned to the facility in 1993. The intensive care unit, which had historically recorded approximately 20 to 30 patient deaths per year, a figure consistent with the serious nature of the conditions treated there, began to see that number climb. By 1994, the annual death count in the 4-bed unit had exceeded 100, a figure so dramatically out of proportion with the facility's size and historical baseline that it was statistically extraordinary. Hospital staff began to notice that the deaths and sudden deteriorations were not randomly distributed across the schedule, but were concentrated in the shifts when a particular nurse was on duty. The colleagues of Orville Lynn Majors began to observe the pattern with growing unease, and the nickname they gave him in private conversations, the Angel of Death, reflected both their awareness of what they were seeing and their uncertainty about what to do with that awareness. In one documented incident on February 16, 1995, the daughter of a patient named Freddie Dale Wilson was present on the ward when she witnessed Majors inject something into her father's foretube. Moments later, Freddie Dale Wilson died. That eyewitness account would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the prosecution's case. An anonymous letter sent to a state health agency and to local media in the spring of 1995 named Majors directly as the person responsible for the deaths, And it was that letter, combined with the concerns that had been building internally for months, that prompted the Indiana State Department of Health and the Indiana State Police to open a formal investigation in March 1995. Majors was suspended from his nursing position immediately when the investigation began, and his nursing license was suspended by the state in December of that year. What followed over the next 2.5 years was one of the most methodical and painstaking medical investigations in Indiana's history. Investigators reviewed the complete patient records of the facility, comparing deaths and deteriorations against staffing records to establish the statistical picture of what had occurred. The analysis was staggering in its findings. A statistical review determined that Orville Lynn Majors had been on duty during 130 of the 147 deaths that had occurred at the hospital's intensive care unit during the 22 months of his employment there. A further statistical analysis, conducted by an expert who testified at trial, determined that the death rate in the unit was 43 times higher when Majors was on shift than when he was not, a figure that was essentially impossible to attribute to coincidence. 15 bodies were exhumed over the course of the investigation, and toxicological examinations of the remains produced evidence of potassium chloride and epinephrine in cases where neither substance had any clinical explanation. Searches of a residence previously associated with Majors yielded vials of potassium chloride, boxes of epinephrine, syringes, needles, and medical bags that appeared to have come from the hospital. Majors was arrested at his home in Clinton, Indiana on December 29, 1997, and charged with 6 counts of murder, with a 7th count added shortly afterward. The prosecutors who reviewed the full range of the investigation, including Clay County Prosecutor Jill Gonzalez and her co-counsel Greg Carter, made a deliberate decision to charge only the 7 cases for which they believed the medical and testimonial evidence was strongest, understanding that the jury would need to be persuaded beyond reasonable doubt on each specific charge rather than by the overall pattern alone. His trial began in September 1999 and lasted 5 weeks. 79 witnesses testified, including 23 physicians and medical experts who explained to the jury in detail the effects of potassium chloride and epinephrine when administered to patients in the quantities the evidence suggested, and the manner in which those effects would present as sudden cardiac arrest, indistinguishable without toxicological testing from the natural deaths that might be expected in a population of seriously ill ICU patients. The jury deliberated for more than 3 days and returned guilty verdicts on 6 of the 7 counts, deadlocking on the 7th. Judge Ernest Yelton, who presided over the case, sentenced Majors to the maximum available sentence on each count, 60 years per conviction, resulting in a total sentence of 360 years in prison. In delivering that sentence, Judge Yelton looked directly at Majors and said, "It is the judgment of this court that the maximum penalty is the minimally reasonable sentence in this case." He described a man who had been entrusted with the care of people at their most vulnerable and had instead used that position of trust to end their lives. Majors maintained his innocence throughout the trial and continued to do so after his conviction, refusing all interview requests during the years he spent at Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. The community of Clinton, Indiana, and the wider county was left to process not only the individual tragedy of the deaths, but the institutional implications of what had occurred. Vermilion County Hospital was fined $80,000 by the state for negligence and code violations relating to its failure to investigate the pattern of deaths earlier and more thoroughly. The families of dozens of patients who had died during Majors' tenure filed wrongful death lawsuits against the hospital, and the facility's name was eventually changed, a reflection of the degree to which its identity had become permanently associated in the public mind with what had happened there during those 22 months. Orville Lynn Majors died in Indiana State Prison on September 24, 2017, at the age of 56. The cause of death was recorded as heart failure, a natural death in the institution where he had been sent to spend the rest of his life. He was convicted of 6 murders, but investigators who studied his case believed he was responsible for the deaths of between 100 and 130 patients and the families of those additional victims, the people who died at Vermilion County Hospital during the period of his employment and whose deaths were never formally attributed to him, have never received the formal acknowledgement of what happened to their loved ones that the 6 confirmed victims' families received. Through the criminal process, Number 6. Kristen Gilbert, the nurse who engineered medical emergencies to impress her boyfriend. The Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts, known locally as the Leeds VA, stood as a place of care and sanctuary for the men who had served the United States in its armed forces, a facility dedicated to the proposition that those who had sacrificed for their country deserved to receive the best possible medical attention in return. The patients on Ward C of that facility in the 1990s were veterans, men who had endured the rigors of military service and who came to the VA in states of illness and vulnerability that made the quality of the care they received a matter of life and death in the most direct sense. They trusted the institution that had been created to serve them, and by extension, they trusted the nurses who moved through their ward in the late afternoon and evening hours, checking lines and adjusting medications and responding to the coded emergencies that were an unavoidable part of intensive medical care. Kristen Gilbert was one of those nurses. She worked the 4 to midnight shift on Ward C, and she had, in the early years of her employment there, a reputation for competence and dedication that earned her the respect of her colleagues. She was also, by the accounts of those who knew her personally, a woman of considerable charm and social intelligence, capable of making the people around her feel noticed and valued. But beneath that exterior was a person whose behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning as the years went on, and whose actions on Ward C during the 1990s resulted in the deaths of at least 4 veterans and the near deaths of 2 others, with investigators and statisticians who studied the records of the ward believing that the true number of patients harmed may have been far higher. Kristen Heather Strickland was born on November 13, 1967, in Fall River, Massachusetts, a city with its own complicated history in the American true crime narrative, and grew up in what appeared from the outside to be an ordinary suburban household. She was academically gifted and graduated from high school at 16, a detail that speaks to an intellect that was real and substantial even as the personality that surrounded it was developing in troubling directions. Those who knew her as a teenager and young adult described a person who could be charming and engaging, but who also exhibited a persistent pattern of manipulation and compulsive dishonesty, constructing versions of events and representations of herself that served her purposes in the moment without apparent concern for their accuracy or their effect on others. She trained as a nurse and was hired at the Northampton Veterans Affairs Medical Center in 1989, initially in roles that kept her away from direct patient care before eventually being assigned to Ward C. In the years she worked there, she met and began a relationship with James Perot, a VA police officer whose responsibilities included responding to the medical emergencies that were called throughout the hospital whenever a patient suffered a sudden and serious deterioration. The hospital's rules required VA police to be present at every coded emergency, which meant that when Kristen Gilbert called a code on Ward C, James Perot would be among the responders who arrived. Prosecutors would later argue, in a theory that was central to their case and supported by the testimony of multiple witnesses, that Gilbert engineered medical crises among her patients specifically to create the emergencies that would bring Perot to her ward, to allow her to demonstrate her nursing skills in the high-pressure setting of a resuscitation, and to maintain the attention and engagement of a man whose interest she was determined to keep. The method she used was the injection of epinephrine, commonly known as adrenaline, into the intravenous therapy bags of her patients. Epinephrine, administered in controlled and medically appropriate quantities, is used in genuine emergencies to stimulate a heart that has stopped. But administered in overdose to a patient whose heart is functioning normally, or in quantities far exceeding what any clinical situation would justify, epinephrine causes the heart to race uncontrollably and then fail. The cardiac arrests that followed her injections were indistinguishable, in their outward presentation, from the natural cardiac emergencies that occurred in a ward caring for seriously ill patients, and that near invisibility was what allowed her to continue for as long as she did. The statistical evidence that eventually emerged was extraordinary in its implications. Prosecutors established that Gilbert had been on duty for approximately half of the 350 deaths that had occurred at the VAMC from the time she began working there, and that the statistical probability of this distribution being coincidental was approximately 1 in 100 million. Her confirmed victims, the 4 men whose deaths were prosecuted at trial, were Stanley Jagodowski, 66 years old, Henry Huden, 35 years old, Kenneth Cutting, 41 years old, and Edward Squire, 69 years old. Each of them had been a veteran. Each had come to the VA, carrying the particular vulnerabilities of age or illness, and each had died in circumstances that would later be understood as the result of deliberate injection of a substance they had no clinical reason to receive. The investigation that brought Gilbert to account began in February 1996, when 3 nurses on Ward C filed a formal internal inquiry raising their concerns about the pattern of deaths and emergencies on the ward. By that point, Gilbert had already resigned from the hospital following a suicide attempt, and she was institutionalized in a psychiatric facility when the investigation intensified. In one of the most dramatic moments of the case, she placed a telephone call to James Perot from the psychiatric ward and told him, in words he would later repeat under oath in federal court, "You know I did it. I did it. You wanted to know. I killed those guys." Perot went to investigators with that information, and Gilbert's response when she learned that her former boyfriend was cooperating with authorities was to call in a series of bomb threats to the VA hospital in an attempt to disrupt the investigation. She was arrested and convicted for those threats in a separate proceeding in 1998, serving 15 months before facing the murder charges. Her murder trial opened in federal court in Springfield, Massachusetts, in November 2000 and lasted approximately 7 weeks. The prosecution was able to seek the death penalty because the crimes had occurred on federal property, even though Massachusetts had abolished capital punishment in 1984, making Gilbert's case one of the rare instances in modern American legal history where a woman faced execution by the federal government. The jury convicted her on March 14, 2001, finding her guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Stanley Jagodowski, Henry Huden, and Kenneth Cutting, and 1 count of second-degree murder in the death of Edward Squire, along with 2 counts of attempted murder. The penalty phase of the trial, in which the jury was asked to determine whether Gilbert should be sentenced to death or to life in prison, lasted several days and heard testimony from Gilbert's own family, including her father and grandmothers, who pleaded for her life. The jury deliberated for approximately 6 hours before returning a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, sparing her from execution. A federal judge subsequently confirmed that sentence and imposed for consecutive life terms. The families of the veterans Gilbert had killed were divided in their feelings about the death penalty question, with some wanting execution and others expressing that a lifetime of imprisonment was sufficient. What was common to all of them was the devastation of learning that their fathers and husbands and brothers had died not from the illnesses that had brought them to the VA, but at the hands of the person who was supposed to be protecting them. Nancy Cutting, the widow of Kenneth Cutting, said outside the courtroom that she simply wanted Gilbert to sit in jail for the rest of her life. Kristen Gilbert is currently incarcerated at Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, serving her 4 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Number 7. Elizabeth Wettlaufer, the Canadian nurse who confessed her crimes to a pastor, a lawyer, and a boyfriend before anyone called the police. There are cases in the history of healthcare serial killing that raise questions about the failures of institutions, about the systems and oversight mechanisms that should have caught a killer before the death toll reached the number it did. And then there is the case of Elizabeth Wettlaufer, which raises those questions and then adds another that is perhaps even more disturbing: the question of what happens when a person confesses their crimes repeatedly, to multiple individuals across multiple years, and is not reported to the authorities by any of them. Elizabeth Tracy May Wettlaufer was born on June 10, 1967, in Woodstock, Ontario, a small city in southwestern Ontario about 140 kilometers west of Toronto. Her early life was marked by a deeply religious upbringing in a household where faith was central and certain aspects of her developing identity, including her sexuality, were a source of profound tension and shame. She attended London Baptist Bible College, where she studied religious education and counseling, and her time there was troubled, shaped partly by the continued involvement of controlling family members and partly by what she later described as the reparative therapy she was subjected to in an attempt to address feelings that her religious community regarded as incompatible with the faith she had been raised in. The self-hatred and doubt that she said developed during those years became part of the psychological background against which her later crimes would be understood, though they neither excuse nor fully explain what she did. She eventually left Bible College and pursued nursing at Conestoga College, qualifying as a registered nurse and taking up employment in the long-term care facilities that would become the settings for her crimes. She married a truck driver named Donnie Wetlaufer in 1997, and the marriage eventually collapsed. She developed problems with alcohol and prescription medication, and her nursing license was restricted at one point after she was found to have taken medication for her own use. She was suspended multiple times from the Care St. Care nursing home in Woodstock, the facility where she would eventually kill 7 of her 8 victims, before being finally dismissed. After leaving Care St. Care, she moved between several other facilities until she left nursing entirely in 2016. The 8 people Elizabeth Wetlaufer killed were residents of long-term care homes who were elderly, many of them suffering from dementia or other conditions that made them entirely dependent on the staff who cared for them. They were James Silcox, 84, who died in September 2007 and whom Wetlaufer later described as her first victim; Maurice Granat, 84, who died in 2008; Gladys Millard, 87, who died in 2011, whose niece would later describe her grief at learning that her aunt had been murdered as the experience of losing her twice; Helen Matheson, 95, Mary Zurowinski, 96, Helen Young, 90, Maureen Pickering, 79, and Arpad Horvath, 75, who died in August 2014 and was the last of her victims to die in her care. She also attempted to kill 4 additional residents and committed aggravated assaults on 2 others. The method she used in every case was the injection of insulin into patients who were not diabetic, causing their blood sugar to drop to levels that triggered the physiological crises that preceded each death. In her police confession, which was recorded in October 2016 and played in its entirety during her court proceedings, Wetlaufer described experiencing what she called a red surge, a feeling that rose within her before each injection, a sensation she could not fully explain and could not fully control. She said she knew the difference between right and wrong. She said that she had tried to stop. She said that she had told people what she was doing. And that last statement was not a figure of speech or an exaggeration. Over the course of 9 years, Elizabeth Wetlaufer had confessed her crimes to a former boyfriend, to a student nurse working at Care St. Care, to a pastor and his wife, to a lawyer, and to an ex-girlfriend. The pastor had prayed over her and told her never to do it again. The lawyer had advised her to take her secrets to her grave. Others had dismissed her admissions as the talk of someone in a psychiatric episode or had attributed them to pathological dishonesty. Not one of these people reported her to the police. A public inquiry would later conclude that without Wetlaufer's voluntary confession to a treatment facility, she would never have been caught, because no one in any of the institutions where she had worked had identified a pattern, no family member had raised a formal concern that led anywhere, and the deaths of elderly residents in long-term care homes, deaths that could be attributed to the natural decline that was expected in that population, had not triggered the kind of investigation that would have exposed her. The confession that finally mattered came in September 2016, when Wetlaufer, in a state of profound psychological distress, checked herself into the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. There, she disclosed her crimes to staff, who reported them to the appropriate authorities. She was discharged from the facility in early October 2016, and 3 weeks later she was arrested. The Ontario Provincial Police conducted a recorded interview with her on October 5, 2016, lasting more than 2 hours, in which she walked investigators through each victim one by one, providing details that allowed the evidence against her to be assembled case by case from medical records at the facilities where she had worked. She was formally charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder on October 25, 2016, and additional charges of attempted murder and aggravated assault followed in January 2017. She waived her right to a preliminary hearing and pleaded guilty to all charges in open court on June 1, 2017. At her sentencing hearing on June 26, 2017, in a courtroom in Woodstock, Ontario, 28 victim impact statements were received, 19 of which were read aloud by the friends and family members of those she had killed. Ontario Superior Court Justice Bruce Thomas, who presided over the sentencing, described Wetlaufer as a predator who had taken the lives of those she was supposed to protect and characterized her presence in the lives of her victims as a shadow of death that passed over them on the night shift where she supervised. He sentenced her to 8 concurrent life terms in prison with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. Wetlaufer herself addressed the court before sentence was passed and said, "I caused tremendous pain and suffering and death. Sorry is much too small a word. I am extremely sorry." Arpad Horvath, whose father had been one of the victims, said of her apology that it was a waste of time, paper, and air. The case prompted a sweeping provincial public inquiry into the failures of Ontario's long-term care system, led by Commissioner Eileen Gillese, whose final report concluded that systemic failures in oversight and monitoring had created conditions in which a killer could operate undetected for 9 years. Legislative changes followed, aimed at strengthening the mechanisms by which unusual deaths in long-term care facilities are reported and investigated. Elizabeth Wetlaufer remains incarcerated, eligible for her first parole hearing in 2042. Number 8. Janine Jones, the Texas nurse whose victims were babies and whose hospital covered up what it knew. In the summer and autumn of 1981, the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Behar County Medical Center Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, was experiencing something that the nurses and doctors working there found deeply troubling. Children were dying. That statement, in isolation, is not unusual in a pediatric intensive care unit, because the patients admitted to such a unit are by definition among the sickest children in any hospital, and some portion of them will always die despite the best efforts of those caring for them. What was unusual at Behar County was the pattern of those deaths, the timing, the shift on which they concentrated, and the identity of the nurse who was on duty when child after child suffered sudden and unexpected cardiac arrest or hemorrhage or respiratory collapse. In October 1981, a 25-year-old registered nurse named Pat Maldonado gathered her concerns and went to the head nurse of the pediatric ICU, Pat Belko, to raise them formally. She told Belko that too many babies were dying, that they were dying of problems that should not have been fatal, and that the deaths were clustering on a single shift, the 3 to 11 evening shift. The nurse who worked that shift with particular regularity, the nurse who was present at incident after incident, was a licensed vocational nurse named Janine Jones. Janine Jones was born on July 13, 1950, in San Antonio, Texas, and was adopted as an infant into the family of Dick and Gladys Jones. Her adoptive father was a professional gambler who ran a nightclub business, and her adoptive mother reportedly struggled with alcohol, and the household in which Jones grew up was one where the adults were frequently absent and emotional stability was not reliably available. She grew up with a persistent and powerful need for attention that expressed itself throughout her life in ways that became increasingly serious in their consequences. She sought the spotlight in medical settings, was drawn to the drama of crisis and emergency, and appeared to derive a sense of significance from being present at moments of life and death that those around her found increasingly uncomfortable as the pattern became clear. She trained as a licensed vocational nurse, a qualification that did not require the full training of a registered nurse, and took up employment at Behar County Medical Center's Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, where she became a fixture on the evening shift and developed a reputation that combined apparent dedication with a hunger for the kind of attention that emergencies provided. Nurses working alongside her noticed that she seemed energized rather than distressed by pediatric crises, that she was always present, always eager to be at the center of a resuscitation, always ready to step in when a child's condition deteriorated. An expert analysis conducted later for the Centers for Disease Control found that during the 15 months of the most intensive period of the deaths on her shift, children admitted to the unit were 25 times more likely to suffer cardiac arrest than at other times, and 10 times more likely to die. The internal investigation that followed Maldonado's formal complaint revealed that Jones had been present at the time of death of every child who had died during the concentrated period under review, and that the hospital's administrators, confronted with this finding, chose not to call the police. Desperate to avoid the legal liability and the reputational damage that a public disclosure would bring, they quietly restructured the unit's staffing in a way that would prevent vocational nurses like Jones from working in the pediatric ICU, effectively removing her without calling law enforcement or alerting any subsequent employer to the concerns that had accumulated against her. They gave her a good professional reference. Janine Jones then went to work for a pediatrician named Dr. Kathleen Holland, who had opened a private clinic in the small town of Kerrville in the Texas Hill Country, about an hour's drive from San Antonio. She took up her duties at the clinic in the spring of 1982, and almost immediately the pattern that had begun in San Antonio transferred to Kerrville. Children brought to Dr. Holland's clinic for routine appointments began to suffer sudden and severe medical crises. Among them was Chelsea McClellan, a 15-month-old girl who was brought to the clinic in September 1982 for what should have been a routine visit. Chelsea suffered sudden respiratory collapse during the appointment, was rushed to a nearby hospital, revived, and then brought back to the clinic the following week, at which point she suffered another collapse. This time she could not be revived, and Chelsea McClellan died on September 17, 1982. The investigation that followed, triggered partly by the concerns of medical professionals in Kerrville who found the pattern of crises at the Holland Clinic inexplicable, and partly by a pharmacist who noticed that vials of succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant with no routine use in a pediatric outpatient clinic, had gone missing from the clinic's supplies, eventually produced evidence that Jones had been administering unauthorized injections to the children in her care. Succinylcholine, in sufficient doses, causes complete muscular paralysis, including paralysis of the muscles required for breathing, and its administration to a healthy child would produce precisely the kind of sudden respiratory collapse that had claimed Chelsea McClellan. Jones was tried in 1984 for the murder of Chelsea McClellan, and the prosecution presented evidence of the missing medication, the pattern of crises, and the testimony of medical experts who explained the pharmacological effects of succinylcholine in a way that made the cause of Chelsea's death clear. Jones was convicted and sentenced to 99 years in prison. She was also convicted in a separate proceeding of administering a near-fatal dose of heparin, a blood thinner, to a 4-week-old baby boy named Rolando Santos, who survived and received a concurrent 60-year sentence for that offense. Under a mandatory sentencing law designed to address prison overcrowding that had been in place in Texas since 1977, Jones was scheduled for mandatory release in March 2018, a prospect that horrified investigators, prosecutors, and the families of her victims. Prosecutors in Bexar County, led by District Attorney Nico LaHood, moved swiftly to prevent that release by filing new indictments in 2017 charging Jones with the murders of 5 additional babies whose deaths had never been prosecuted. In January 2020, facing the first of those trials, Jones entered a guilty plea to the murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer, who had died on December 12, 1981, from an overdose of Dilantin, an anti-seizure medication, at Bexar County Hospital. She was sentenced to life in prison for that murder, with the remaining 4 charges dropped as part of the plea agreement. District Judge Frank Castro, delivering the sentence, told Jones, "You took God's most precious gift, babies, defenseless, innocent." Joshua Sawyer's mother, Connie Weeks, stood just steps from Jones as the sentence was delivered and told her, "I'm glad that you will never see daylight. I hope you live a long and miserable life behind bars." Janine Jones is currently incarcerated, having been in prison continuously since her first conviction in 1984. She is 76 years old. The true number of babies who died as a result of her actions will likely never be established with certainty, in part because Bexar County Medical Center destroyed a significant quantity of medical records from the period in question shortly after the investigation began in 1982, a destruction that was characterized by investigators as deeply suspicious, and which meant that a substantial portion of the documentary evidence that might have allowed the full scale of Jones's crimes to be assessed was permanently lost. Number 9. Donald Harvey, the hospital orderly who killed for 17 years and called it mercy. When investigators in Cincinnati, Ohio, sat down in the spring of 1987 to try to understand how many people Donald Harvey had killed, they were confronted with a problem that is in some ways unique to healthcare serial killing. Harvey had been employed in hospitals and medical facilities for the better part of 2 decades, moving between institutions, changing roles, and operating in environments where death was a daily reality and where the line between a natural death and a suspicious one was, in many cases, extraordinarily difficult to draw without the kind of targeted forensic investigation that was not routinely applied to patient deaths. By the time Harvey entered his guilty plea in 1987 and began the process of accounting for what he had done, investigators estimated that his victims numbered at least 37, and Harvey himself claimed that the true figure was closer to 87, a number that, if accurate, would place him among the most prolific serial killers in the history of the United States. Donald Harvey was born on April 15, 1952, in Hamilton, Ohio, and grew up in Boonville, Kentucky, a small Appalachian community where his family lived in poverty in the mountains of the eastern part of the state. By his own account, given in various interviews and in conversations with law enforcement, his childhood was marked by the kind of rural isolation and economic hardship that characterized many communities in that part of Kentucky at the time, and also by experiences of abuse, which he said had occurred at the hands of an uncle and a neighbor when he was as young as 4 years old. Whether those early experiences contributed to the psychology that would eventually drive him to kill is a question that cannot be answered with confidence. But Harvey himself cited them repeatedly when attempting to explain himself, alongside claims of psychiatric illness that he said had gone untreated when treatment might still have mattered. He entered the healthcare field in May 1970, at the age of 18, when he applied for a position as a hospital orderly at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. The vetting processes for such positions at that time were not rigorous, and Harvey began work almost immediately. Within 2 weeks of starting the job, he made his first known attempt to take a patient's life, and within a month he had succeeded. His first confirmed victim was Logan Evans, an 88-year-old stroke patient who was incontinent and who, by Harvey's own later account, had smeared feces on him in a moment of distress or confusion. Harvey took a pillow and pressed it over the old man's face until he was dead, then listened to his heart with a stethoscope to confirm that life had ended, dressed him in a clean hospital gown, and reported the death to the duty nurse. It was recorded as natural causes. What followed over the next 17 years was a killing career that moved between multiple facilities, employed a variety of methods, and claimed victims whose connection to Harvey ranged from patients entirely unknown to him to people with whom he had personal relationships. At Marymount Hospital, he killed at least 13 patients before leaving the facility under circumstances that involved a separate criminal matter. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1971, but his military service was troubled and he was eventually discharged. He worked a series of jobs in the years that followed, spending time in and out of psychiatric care, before eventually re-entering healthcare and taking up positions first at the Cincinnati Veterans Administration Medical Center and then at the Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio, where the most concentrated period of his killing would take place. At Drake Memorial, Harvey worked as a nurse's aide in the cardiac and intensive care units, positions that gave him direct access to patients and to the full range of medications and equipment available in those settings. His methods evolved significantly during this period, moving beyond the physical suffocation of his first killing toward the use of poisons that were harder to detect and that could be administered in ways that left little obvious evidence. He used arsenic and cyanide most frequently, introducing them into the food and beverages he served to patients, into gastric tubes, and through other means of administration that were available to him in his role as a ward aide. Some patients he suffocated by allowing their oxygen tanks to run out while ensuring that no replacement was arranged. Others he harmed by removing breathing tubes or tampering with medical equipment in ways that induced deterioration. He claimed, in statements given after his arrest, that many of his killings were motivated by a sense of mercy, that he was ending the suffering of patients who were in pain or who he judged to have no meaningful prospect of recovery. But investigators who studied his full victim list found that claim deeply unconvincing as a complete explanation, because many of those he killed were not terminally ill, and some of the people he harmed or killed had no connection to healthcare at all, including former roommates, neighbors, and personal acquaintances who had in some way crossed him or made him feel threatened. The investigation that ended Harvey's career came about through chance in a way that is both extraordinary and deeply troubling, because it reflects how close he came to never being caught at all. On March 7, 1987, a 44-year-old man named John Powell was admitted to Drake Memorial Hospital following a motorcycle accident. Harvey attended to Powell in the course of his duties and, by his own later account, administered cyanide through Powell's gastric tube before leaving at the end of his shift. Powell died, and his death was initially attributed to the injuries he had sustained in the accident. But when the deputy coroner assigned to the autopsy bent over the body, he smelled something that was immediately and unmistakably distinctive. He smelled cyanide, a substance that has a characteristic almond-like odor that is detectable to those who know what they are looking for. The deputy coroner alerted investigators. Harvey was identified as the aide who had attended to Powell, and when police began their inquiry, he refused a polygraph examination before eventually agreeing to speak with investigators. In the course of those conversations, he admitted to killing Powell, claiming he had done so out of sympathy for Powell's family. Evidence quickly accumulated that Powell was not an isolated case, and Harvey entered into an agreement with prosecutors in which he would plead guilty to dozens of murders in exchange for the guarantee that the death penalty would not be sought. He pleaded guilty in August 1987 to 24 murders in Ohio and was sentenced to life in prison. He subsequently pleaded guilty in Kentucky to 8 additional murders and 1 count of manslaughter. His total sentence was 28 consecutive life terms plus $270,000 in fines. He lived out his sentence at the Toledo Correctional Institution in Ohio, refusing all interview requests until he eventually agreed to speak at length with one journalist. On March 28, 2017, Harvey was found in his cell having been beaten by another inmate. He was taken to a nearby hospital and died 2 days later on March 30, 2017, at the age of 64, from injuries sustained in the attack. He died the way so many of his victims had died, in a hospital, with his body failing, before anyone who cared for him could do anything to stop it. Number 10. Jane Toppan, the Victorian nurse who wanted to kill more people than anyone in history. There is a statement attributed to Jane Toppan, made during the period of her confession in 1901 and reported widely in the newspapers of the time, that stands as perhaps the most chilling articulation of motive ever recorded in the history of nursing serial killers. She said that her goal in life had been to have killed more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived. She said it with a calmness and a lack of remorse that chilled to the bone the experienced physicians and forensic specialists who interviewed her, men who had spent their careers in the darkest corners of human psychology and who nonetheless found in Jane Toppan something they had not encountered before. She was, by the time those words were recorded, a woman in her late 40s who had spent the better part of 20 years moving through the homes of families in the Boston area and along the Massachusetts coast, nursing the elderly and infirm with an apparent warmth and dedication that earned her the nickname Jolly Jane among the patients and families who trusted her. Beneath that jolly exterior was a person who had been constructing a secret life of extraordinary darkness for 2 decades, poisoning the people in her care with a combination of morphine and atropine, and finding in the slow process of their dying a form of satisfaction that she would eventually describe in confessions so disturbing that those who heard them found it difficult to reconcile the descriptions with the plump, cheerful woman who offered them with such apparent equanimity. Jane Toppan was born on Nora Kelly on March 31, 1854, in Boston, Massachusetts, to Irish immigrant parents. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Nora was very young, and her father, a man known in local communities by the grim nickname Kelly the Crack, was unable or unwilling to care for his daughters and left Nora and her sister Delia at the Boston Female Asylum, an institution for orphaned and abandoned children, when Nora was approximately 8 years old. The circumstances of her early childhood, the loss of her mother, the abandonment by her father, the institutional upbringing in an orphanage where resources were limited and personal attention was rare, shaped a psychology that was, by adulthood, profoundly distorted in its relationship to human attachment and in its response to power and vulnerability. She was taken from the orphanage as a young girl and placed with a widow named Ann Toppan as an indentured servant, a common arrangement of the time in which children from poor backgrounds worked in exchange for room and board, and she took the family's surname, the name by which she would be known for the rest of her life. When she eventually gained her freedom from that arrangement and was given $50, she chose to continue living and working with the Toppan family until circumstances changed. She then enrolled at Cambridge Hospital in Boston to train as a nurse, and it was during her training that the first incidents that should have prompted alarm occurred. She was not well liked by her fellow trainees, who found her a persistent gossip and noticed a tendency toward dishonesty about her background and circumstances. More significantly, at least one patient, a woman named Amelia Finney who had been recovering from surgery, later reported that Toppan had administered a bitter-tasting medication to her during her recovery that caused disturbing symptoms and from which she was lucky to have recovered. The Cambridge hospital eventually dismissed Toppan from her training program, a decision that she experienced as a profound rejection and that closed off the institutional route to nursing practice. Her response was to establish herself as a private nurse, offering her services directly to families in the Boston area who needed someone to care for an elderly or infirm relative. It was in this capacity that she found the access to victims that would sustain her killing for 2 decades. Private nursing in the late 19th century placed a caregiver in extraordinary proximity to the vulnerable, often in the intimate setting of a private home, with minimal oversight and no institutional accountability of the kind that might have caught her earlier. Toppan moved between households, caring for patients, befriending families, and administering her poison with a methodical deliberateness that she described in her confession in terms that were both technically precise and deeply disturbing. The mixture she used most frequently was morphine and atropine, drugs whose effects counteracted each other in ways that made the resulting symptoms confusing and difficult to attribute to poisoning, particularly in patients who were already elderly or ill. She described in her confession the pleasure she derived from the process, from watching her patients move toward unconsciousness and then drawing them back, administering enough to bring them to the edge of death, and then reducing the dose to allow partial recovery, before administering the final quantity that ended their lives. She described climbing into bed with some of her victims as they were dying, holding them close, deriving a form of emotional satisfaction from the experience of physical proximity to someone at the moment of their death that went beyond what any clinical or psychological framework of the time had the language to adequately describe. In the summer of 1901, Toppan was employed as the on-call nurse for the Davis family of Lowell, Massachusetts, who spent their summers at a property in Catomet, a small village on Cape Cod. Over the course of that summer, she administered her poison to multiple members of the Davis family in succession, and the deaths accumulated with a speed that eventually attracted the attention of a surviving family member who demanded that a physician examine the circumstances. Toxicological analysis of one of the victims revealed evidence of poisoning, and Toppan was arrested on October 29, 1901. The investigation that followed was not a long or complicated one, because Toppan, in conversations with the doctors and forensic specialists who were brought in to assess her state of mind, was remarkably forthcoming. She confessed to 31 murders, and she confessed them with a detachment and a specificity that left no reasonable doubt about the accuracy of her account. She described each case in clinical detail, identifying the substances she had used, the methods she had employed, and the effect she had observed. The victims she named included members of the Davis family, the head nurse at Cambridge Hospital whose position she had coveted, patients she had grown tired of, and people who had no professional connection to her at all, former landlords, neighbors, and a woman who was the foster sister she had grown up alongside in the Toppan household. Her trial began on June 23, 1902, and lasted only 8 hours. Both the prosecution and the defense had agreed, on the basis of the psychiatric evidence, that Toppan was not legally sane in the sense required for a criminal conviction, and the jury deliberated for just 20 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Toppan was committed to the Taunton State Lunatic Hospital for the remainder of her natural life. She was, reportedly, pleased with the verdict, believing that she would be able to convince hospital staff of her sanity within a few months and secure her release. That release never came. She lived at Taunton until her death on August 17, 1938, at the age of 84, having spent 37 years in institutional care. In her final years, she suffered from dementia, and one of the nurses who cared for her toward the end of her life reported that Toppan, in a moment of apparent clarity, looked at the other patients on her ward and said to the nurse, "Dearie, you and I could have such fun." She died in the same institution where she had been confined, in the same building where she had been housed since her commitment, a woman who had wanted above everything else to kill more helpless people than anyone in history. and who had spent the last 4 decades of her life in circumstances of genuine helplessness herself, dependent on the care of others to survive. Watched over by nurses who knew exactly who she was and what she had done.